So I'm going to talk about a relatively new project that's a national program on adaptive silviculture for climate change. We call it ASK. And I'm going to focus on the component of it in the northern forest. And I just want to start by acknowledging Anthony D'Amato from the University of Vermont and Chris Waddell from the U.S. Forest Service. And they're really the PIs on this project. And I tried desperately to twist their arms to come down and have one of them present this because they're so good at it, but they weren't able to do this. So I'm kind of the messenger in this project. I have been involved in the Northern Forest Ask for the last 3 years, so certainly something that I'm involved in. But I wanted to give credit to these two folks. So why adaptive silviculture and why now? So we saw a great talk this morning by Art DeGaetano, and we in this room where we're all aware that there's, indisputable and increasing evidence for recent climate change and increases in the frequency and severity of extreme weather events, and a growing recognition that there's more of this to come. I don't have to preach that. So I don't need to talk about climate change, past, present, or future. Also, I'm assuming you're in this room because you're interested in forests, and we all know that forest species are long-lived. They grow across a range of climatic conditions. We often call that the climatic envelope. And they have already experienced, those that are 100, 200 years old, they've already experienced shifting climate and changes in weather. However, despite that, there is concern that current and future climatic conditions are going to be so novel that forest tree species might not be able to adapt. They might not be able to keep up with this rapid change in climate. So signs of stress that we look for are decreased productivity, decreased regeneration, increased susceptibility to pests and pathogens, increased mortality, and increased competition from other native or invasive species. So, kind of based on the change in climate, some of these concerns, there really is this emerging need to know, and a need to know how to manage our forests of tomorrow today. And this is something that I can say in my experience. I've been working on climate change research, believe it or not, since the early 1990s, and we've spent so much time, trying to convince people, that the climate is changing in a predictable manner. We need to do something about it. And now I go to public talks and people say, Lindsey, enough with the climate is changing. We get it. Tell us what to do. So that's what ASK is all about, is trying to come up from the silvicultural forest management perspective of what can we do to be proactive in the face of a changing climate. So ASK, kind of distilling this on the 30,000-foot view, there are three basic overarching goals. The first is to design and implement a long-term management and research network to address best practices for climate-informed silvicultural strategies. And the second is this real emphasis that within this network, we want to encourage manager-scientist partnerships to generate options and tools for integrating climate change adaptation into silvicultural planning decision-making. So we often have been siloed, right? There's the researchers, and then there's the forest managers, and we haven't always done the best job of coming together. So this is a program from its foundations are trying to bring researchers and managers together to do kind of the old kind of cliche now, but climate smart silviculture. The third thing is very ambitious, and that's to establish a replicated long-term multi-region experiment on adaptive silviculture for climate change. And if we zoom in on this, this is a program that's been in existence for 7 or 8 years. It was initiated by Jim Golden, Connie Millar, Linda Nagel, and others. And there are now 5 of these sites across the country. There's the Cutthroat Experimental Forest at the Chippewa National Forest. There's a San Juan National Forest. Down in the southeast is Jones Ecological Center. Up here in the Pacific Northwest is the Flathead National Forest. And then here we are, one of the newest of the sites, which is in northern New Hampshire at the Dartmouth Second College Grant. And this is one I've been involved with and that I'll be talking about in the future. There is interest right now in establishing another one on the coast of California, another one in California, and a lot of interest in establishing an urban ask site. So it's really gaining momentum in coming together in individual sites and as a network. So to be part of this group, to be part of this network, you have to agree to participate in the ask design. And in the ask design, there are basically some common design features that are common across all the forests: adaptation options, resistance, resilience, transition, no action. I'm going to go through what that means. There's minimum study design elements that you have to agree to implement. I'll go through those in a minute. And then there's site-specific deployment. They're going to be unique to your individual forest. So I'll go through examples of this. The one that's kind of most difficult to wrap, and for me, was to kind of wrap your brain around is adaptation options. So we talked about resistance, resilience, and transition. Well, what does that mean? So the resistance treatment is actions that help forests resist change and maintain unchanged conditions over time. So I think of my backyard and I think of beech, birch, maple forest, and I think of what actions would we take to maintain that exactly as it is now, as a beech, birch, maple forest. Resilience is a little bit different, but it's actions that allow forests some change but promote eventual return to approximate prior conditions. So again, if I think of my backyard and I think of a beech, birch, maple forest, what actions could I take that would keep it kind of generically a beech, birch, maple forest, but it might be red maple instead of sugar maple because red maple adapts to more of the conditions that we expect. It might be provenances of American beech that are particularly resistant to beech bark disease. So it would be keeping the general structure and function of the forest with tweaks that allow it to be more resilient under future climates. The most ambitious is transitions, and you may have heard of this as assisted migration. Connie Millar has a wonderful paper, kind of foundational paper on that. And these are actions that proactively foster forest change to create new, more adapted conditions. So here is my beech, birch, maple forest in my backyard, and maybe that should be an oak hickory forest. Okay, so it's very aggressive transition. And then the one that most of us probably do most often is no action, no management intervention. So these are the 4 adaptation options. Minimum design elements. Again, you're going to be part of this network. You have to agree to do replication with 4 full blocks, so 4 true replicates of each of the 4 treatments. And each treatment has to be on a plot that's at least 10 hectares per treatment, about 25 acres. So that's 160 hectares, about 400 acres. That's a reasonably big plot of land when you go out to look for it to do one of these. It doesn't fit in my backyard, for example. Monitoring guidelines, there's a list. I didn't reproduce it here, but it's basic forest mensuration for overstory, midstory, and ground layer. An evaluation window. You really need a plot of land that's going to be preserved and put away for 50 plus years. And again, 400 acres, 50 plus years, you're looking for working forests. That's actually hard to get buy-in on that. So these are the basic minimum design. Now you go to the site. Now there's a little bit more flexibility. So within your region, you have to decide what's the forest type that's most important. So in the north, likely beech, birch, maple, or mixed wood forests. And then you have to find a steady site. So in the Northeast, it really took us a full year and a half to find a steady site, because we went to the experimental forest, we went to Hubbard Brook, we went to Bartlett, we went to White Mountain National Forest, and honestly, none of us could find, the right representative piece of land that we could preserve, for 50 plus years, that we could put away for these treatments. You would think it would be easy, but it actually wasn't, even the great northern forests of New Hampshire. So we ended up in a working forest at the Dartmouth grant, and I'll tell you more about that. So local site and local issues and goals. We recognize, just like the hubs, right? One size doesn't fit all. So it's really important that local researchers and local managers work together on local issues. Adaptation approaches, co-production of treatment designs, and I'll come back to what we mean by that, and then a field monitoring plan, what's going to work at your specific site. So those are the site-specific elements. Co-production of treatment. So there's kind of a prescription of how we want you to go about doing this. And we have a minimum of a 2-day workshop for each local ask site, and to include the managers and the scientists. And so the first 2 parts are overview of climate change trends, impacts, and vulnerabilities for the region. Make sure everybody's on the same page. The second part is tour, boots on the ground, right? Go out to discuss ecological, operational, silvicultural, management, I said ecological, research considerations. And then the manager scientist teams come together to co-design each experimental treatment, that is a resistance, a resilience, and the transition. And to do that, they first need to sit down and decide what are the desired future conditions. You'll see this as DFC. I hate acronyms, but desired future conditions. What do you want your stand to look like? What are your objectives? The second part are, what are the key outcomes? So going down, digging a little bit deeper. What kinds of species composition? What's the forest health? What's the productivity? What's the response to disturbance? Really lay these out very specifically. And then the third part is tactics. Okay, how do we get from where we are now to where we want to go? So that's all part of this in-person, hands-on meeting. So as an example, the Northern Forest Ask, this is one. As I said, we started talking about in 2014 and actually just initiated the treatments last fall. The forest ecosystem, northern hardwood and mixed wood. If you can see this is a forest road, kind of gives you that mixed wood feeling. And the site is the second Dartmouth grant, which is way up here in northern New Hampshire. This just shows you, again, where we are within the second college grant. These 4 blocks are actually located in a northern site and a southern site. At the northern site, you can see the 2 kind of blocks of treatments, and again, the southern site. So again, I'm sure you've all set up field experiments or plots trying to wiggle these in, so they fit in these management units. Again, we started talking about it in 2014. We had that 2-day meeting in August of 2016. 2017 was pre-manipulation monitoring, and then the treatments were imposed in the late summer and fall of 2017. The experimental treatments that our group came up with was resistance, and this was again to maintain the basic structure and function species composition that we had to begin with, was to use single tree selection, use a multi-cohort structure, try to increase the amount of down dead wood, and try to favor beech bark disease resistant residual stems. So this was what we were going to go in to keep that forest as that forest. Resilience was a little bit of tweak of this, more of a group selection, opening up more gaps in the canopy, trying to keep areas that might be a little bit cooler, trying to promote, an increased number of species. So multiple pathways here. Again, that kind of tweaking from sugar maple to red maple, and again, really trying to preserve, the American beech in the stand. We were also trying to increase down dead wood and promote species that were wind and ice resistant species. So again, kind of a recipe, for our own backyard. And then the transition, variable density, irregular shelter wood, and increase the presence of future adapted species. So again, we didn't clear cut it, but we created fairly large gaps in the canopy and then planted along with our native species, oak, hickory, cherry, black birch, aspen, and brought in greater presence of red spruce. So kind of give you a sense of what it looks like in the northern forest. For us, key research questions were what trade-offs exist between managing for climate adaptation versus climate mitigation. We haven't talked that much about mitigation in this conference yet, but in forestry, you can stuff a lot of carbon in forests, right? In standing trees and organic matter and in dead wood. So that's a real climate change mitigation. But that's a different strategy than adaptation. So we are interested in what do those different strategies look like, although we're not doing mitigation. I will kind of say that right up front. Second is, what is the effectiveness of adaptive silviculture at minimizing the negative impacts of extreme events in non-native species relative to traditional silvicultural approaches? Remember, we're doing this in a working forest, so we're surrounded by many, many, many hectares of land that's being managed kind of in a more traditional format. So that's a real positive for where we're working. And then the ecologist, on the team is, how does adaptive silviculture affect key ecosystem processes, carbon, nitrogen, water cycling, all the familiar culprits. We also, the response variables, just to give you a flavor of that, the forest mensuration, those basic response variables, and then we have a lot of focus on animal populations, breeding birds, pollinators, mammals, insects, and then down here some of our nutrient cycling, coarse woody debris, soil carbon, litter decomposition, this mushroom truffle abundance, and then we have some large-scale imaging that we're doing. So again, we have the basic program, and then we have what we're adding that's kind of specific to our research group. We also get a bonus question at the Northern Forest Ask, and that is about coarse woody debris. So what is the role of standing and downed woody debris in forest adaptation to climate change? It's kind of a side project here. And we know that standing down woody debris can help reduce overland flow. It can conserve moisture during periods of drought. And of course, it's a habitat for micro and macro fauna. On the negative side, the more you have, you could come up to conditions of greater fire load. So that might be cause of concern. So we have a wired wood project at the Hubbard Brook Experimental Forest. We're taking down logs. We're putting moisture sensors in the soil around, collecting soil solutions. So it's a pretty intensively monitored dead wood project. So the wired wood project at Hubbard Brook. So back to the national program. Just to wrap this up, I just have 2 more slides. There was a meeting in January, so you can see this kind of funneling from the national level to the site level, and then coming back up to the national level. So periodic meetings of folks from across the country, and these are some of the big scale umbrella questions that the whole program is asking. So from the social and management side, there are questions of, will adaptation approaches work in a real world context? We heard things like that this morning. We'll hear that throughout this meeting. Are the silvicultural treatments fiscally and socially feasible, kind of coupled with number 1? How do the desired future conditions change across sites and regions? It's kind of a really interesting question of what do we think is important versus what they think in Tennessee or California or Oregon. Is there a convergence of what we think is important, or are we just all over the map? What does it mean to create a future adapted forest? And why would a manager choose to do this? right? A little bit along the lines of the questions this morning is, why would you care about, adaptation in agriculture? Do foresters, are they really concerned about climate? That they want to go to this adaptive silviculture approach? It's a really interesting question. And finally, what trade-offs exist between achievement of adaptation objectives and other common objectives for the region? Whether it's economic or social or aesthetic or recreation. What's the trade-off with all of these, and how does that vary across the country? From the science side, of course, we're always interested, is there a significant effect of the treatments on forest conditions and processes over time? Pattern and process in forested ecosystems, and how is that affected by these treatments? Do these treatments achieve the desired future conditions that they were designed for? Is there a match in that? Can we do that? Or are the forcing factors too great or unanticipated? And are there trends in which treatments perform better than others? Some treatments perform better than others in meeting desired future conditions across all ask sites. Again, a tremendous opportunity to delve deeply into your own site, but be able to do kind of national, continental scale comparisons. So, it's a very ambitious program. It's relatively new. A few of the sites or a few papers that are just beginning to come out. But if you have questions about it or you're interested in this, you can certainly contact me or any of my co-conspirators here. So thank you to my co-conspirators, a couple folks for the photos that were contributed, and you can contact me, or if you want, you can follow me and see what we're doing in New Hampshire. So that's what I got.
Obviously, like 50 years is a really long time to manage for anything, and there's, and there's already so many threats, some climate-driven, some not, to forest, deer pressure, disease pressure. Is there a certain amount of management built into these sites to make sure that something just doesn't destroy everything?
I think it would just be that they're part of the management program. So this is incorporated into the management program at the Dartmouth second grant. So hopefully it's a group of dedicated intergenerational scientists and managers that will come together at every year or two to review what's going on and look at results. There'll certainly be some early results on regeneration and seedling establishment and nutrient cycling and dead wood. I think there's going to be a lot that's going to come out of it, but the long term, it's tough, and that's a conversation that I hope we can have after the second talk with long-lived species, like forestry species. How do we do these experiments, and address that question of how do we manage the forests of tomorrow today?
I know that the whole point of the experiment is to see what happens, but none of us, few of us will be around 50 years from now, but, looking into your crystal ball, how do you think it's kind of going to work out? Guesses?
My guess is we're not going to see a lot of difference between the resistance and the resilient treatment, but we'll see the transition of forest being dramatically different. And whether that actually does better under a future climate or not will be very interesting. Part of it depends on how the climate plays out. If we follow along, that highest red trajectory of business as usual, and we see dramatic changes, or certainly, gosh forbid, we see a tipping point, and major changes, those species might be poised to, take off. Now how much successional development we have built into that, is it going to go through it's not going to go through, the pin cherry to northern hardwood to, the maybe more typical maturation process that we have, but, and I say that because from the point of kind of biogeochemistry and ecology, you can hit these systems really, 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 really hard, and a lot of the basic structure and function is maintained. So our ice storm experiment, we're not seeing a lot of biogeochemical response yet to a very significant treatment on that.
My name is David Elson from Oregon, where there are a lot of forest fires. So when I saw your concern about fire with the deadwood, I was wondering how big of a concern that is here.
So fire has not been a big concern in the Northeast. We certainly have forest fires, but it's not like other parts of the country. The interesting thing, though, is our projections for the future is drier soils in a wetter world, that we expect more precipitation, but more of it coming in these large events separated by longer periods of dryness. So we actually anticipate greater threat from forest fires than we've had in the past, even though we've had more water and we'll continue to have more water. So it's on our radar, let's put it that way.
In the vulnerability assessment increased fire risk, but I wasn't sure how you can increase the fire risk.
Right, it's that change in the distribution of precipitation. And again, higher temperatures in the summer, more evaporation, transpiration, more drying out. In fact, we at Hubbard Brook, we're running a drought experiment, which was great because we were running it in 2016 and everybody thought we were, so on top of it, running a drought experiment, anticipating the big drought of 2016. But yeah. And one last question here for now.
I'm from Eastern Shore, part of Maryland, and a lot of always do really well down there to the point where some landowners are taking out the hardwoods, so the lot always do better. One of the concerns is soil intrusion that we have, not just from sea level rise, but because of subsidence from the dump harbor. Do you have any experience with that? Any research that's going on? We just started a project.
Really, really interesting. I tend to work in upland forests, so away from the coast. So I don't actually have experience with that. I don't know if anybody else in the room does. But a lot of interest in doing an urban ask. How do you do adaptive silviculture in urban environments? I think that's a really exciting way to go.